Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 225, The Welsh Calvinist Missionaries in India. This week, we're going to look at the transition from India as a crown corporate colony to the center of the British Empire and imperial power, and how during this transition, Welsh missionary movements affected how the areas, at least certain areas of India, survived and thrived in the face of colonialism. How Welsh religious followers were both a help and a hindrance to the local population, and how they normalized British power even as they sought to preserve the local culture and language. Let us start by defining that British colonial powers started earlier than the period we're referring to here, but it very much wraps up during this period and on afterwards. As one of my professors described it, during the unseemly scramble for Africa. India as an area, or the colony of India as we would think of it today, covers an area which is much bigger than the current country of India. It would include Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a good portion of Burma, and that area would all sort of fall into this Indian colony. And this came about because of the conflict between the French and the English in the 1800s. That victory ended up being the reason why so much changed. Like every other nation in the United Kingdom, Wales had a part in this process, much like how slavery had Welsh people on both sides of the argument, some deeply involved as slavers themselves. Some were beneficiaries of the financial gain that was achieved through this, and others fought against it for various reasons. The relationship between India and Wales came through the East India Company, a monopoly enterprise established under the Royal Charter of 1600 during the final years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign to explore trade in Asia. Keep in mind that one of the reasons why we have this trade going on in that period comes out of a desire to try and go around the Silk Road, or the trade route between Islamic nations and the European powers and the East, and how they effectively wanted to cut out not just the Muslim traders, but also to cut out the Italian city-states who had a lot of control in this period and had far more financial gain from the trade that they did with the rest of Europe. That was part of the reason why Portugal, Spain, and eventually England and France started to try and create access points to the East via different routes than just going through the Silk Road. One of those routes, of course, would be around Africa, and the other being the attempt that would eventually lead to Christopher Columbus's attempt to reach India via the opposite direction of India, and, of course, finding what we now call North, South, and Central America. That process and development came in part as the European powers grew much more powerful and much more influential on the rest of the world, and India ended up in the crossfire. One of the aspects to it was that the French settled colonies, among other European colonists, settled them in India, but they were at the time, one of the stronger colonial powers in the area, right up until the 7 Years' War in 1763, where the end of that war saw India fall back into the hands of the East India Company, who, like I said earlier, gained control of this trade. And during this, Welsh merchants were, of course, involved from the early years, but their influence was dwarfed in number by the English, Scottish, and Irish counterparts, who themselves started to create trade routes and trade access to India. And of course, part of the reason why they wanted access to India was also to gain access to China, where other sources of gunpowder and tea and so many other things were also coming from, not just India. This, of course, meant, as it did in the New World, that people would begin to send money back to Wales as they gained their fortunes. Some would even return, and these were then used to purchase large estates, especially in places like Powys and around Brecon, which became the center of the Welsh version of the East India Company networks. Key figures from this period would include Thomas Parry of Welshpool, who established a prominent merchant house in Madras, modern-day Chennai. I'm going to be honest, much like with Welsh names, Indian names are going to be a bit tricky for me, so if I get them wrong, my apologies. The Indian company E.I.D. Parry still bears his name. Other prominent Welsh nabobs, as they were called, were Robert Wynne of Merioneth and Walker Wilkins of Breconshire and Thomas Jenkins of Cardiganshire. These fortunes from India flowed into Wales through the most famous and notorious of these East India men, Robert Clive, whose vast wealth was partly used to renovate Powys Castle, but by far the most famous of the Welsh East India men, and I apologize for this phrasing, but that's how it's kind of given up, from this period is the Calcutta judge and linguist William Jones, who founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. Jones is chiefly remembered as the key advocate, though not the first, for the common ancestry of European and Indian languages, and defined a definite link between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, something that we know, of course, today is, in fact, accurate. This concept of a Euro-Asian language that had a root in and around areas like this was starting to grow in acceptance as time went on in this period, and especially into the 19th century and beyond. And this was driven from some of these first advocates looking at the commonalities between both the linguistics and how the language was used both then and now. And of course, that is a interesting dynamic, of course, and something that would be much like the later discussions about the origins of humanity would drive a lot of reconsideration of how, where, and why things happened, something that would have massive effects to modern understandings of geology, of human history, of anything to do with archaeology, paleontology, and so many other ologies, if I want to use that phrase. And it would drive so much of what we understand about the world in the modern era. When we think about the British Empire, however, colonial expansion was as much a consequence of hubris as it was about money and power. Dominating the rest of the world picks up serious speed here, and of course, Britain might have lost the 13 colonies in this previous century, but they gained a lot of territory in a very short amount of time, and if we're being blunt, compared to the 13 colonies, it was like getting a diamond mine versus getting a coal mine to compare. The amount of money and wealth that came from India, China, and all these other places, and eventually Africa, far outweighed the money that they were getting from the 13 colonies in what was, at that point at least, a very meager amount of funds from a rural colony that actually they were bleeding money to help fund, which is part of the reason why they started to tax them, which of course created the problem. And so we have this comparison to look at with these two, which is an interesting one, but nonetheless, it is something to note is that while Britain lost a major territory in the 13 colonies, the amount that they gained in the victory over the French was so massive that it's almost not comparable when you look at it. And when we think about the British Empire, we often imagine London at its center, the capital city driving colonial expansion across the world, with the monarch in his castle, or her castle, as the case may be. But what about Wales, a small, proud nation within the larger United Kingdom? What role did Wales play in this vast empire? What was their experience in places like colonial India, and how did they shape both countries? To understand how Welsh men and women found themselves in India, we must first understand Wales's role within the larger British Empire. While Wales itself was a conquered nation, as we've talked about for years, this didn't mean that it was separated from what was going on. It was actually integrated in it. It was a part of it. Again, we've talked about this and how very much it was a part of the British imperial ambitions, and it was driven as frequently as often towards this as anybody else from that time period was. And there was a lot of belief within Wales of the concept of the British nationality, of the British nation. And there was a lot of people who supported that concept. Some ways they were looking at it from their own slant, but nonetheless, there were enough people that definitely believed in it and pushed it. And this had a way of changing and manufacturing a culture from it. Of course, the Welsh identity, language, and culture made the Welsh experience distinct, but they did share the benefits of the British Empire, and because of it, there was this underlying tension between what Welsh culture should be versus what a profitable culture might be, or how to best drive financial gain. What had led some of the Welsh people to embrace this imperial project, while others remained critical of it. The 19th century was a period of significant change in Wales. The Industrial Revolution, of course, brought great wealth to parts of the country, particularly through coal and iron industries, but for many ordinary Welsh people, life remained hard. And this economic hardship drove many to seek opportunities abroad, including within the empire. For some, this meant joining the British Army and Navy. For others, it meant becoming missionaries, hoping to spread the gospel and the Welsh language. While many of these individuals saw their work as part of a broader British mission, they had also often maintained a strong sense of their Welsh identity. In many ways, Welsh involvement in the empire was both a means of survival and a way of asserting their own place within the British system. So Wales had a complicated relationship with empire, a mix of opportunity and exploitation, loyalty and resistance. And one of the places where this dynamic played out most was clearly India. As part of the British Empire, India was central to Britain's wealth and power, as we've stated. India formally became a part of the British Empire in 1858, after the British East India Company had exerted control over much of the subcontinent for over a century. The East India Company was a private entity, but with strong support of the British government. It was effectively a crown corporation. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control, and this marked the start of what would become known as the British Raj, a period of about 90 years where India was ruled as a part of the British Empire, and there was no such thing as an independent India. During this time, British presence in India was widespread, and this included many Welsh people. But the Welsh, much like other parts of the British Isles, brought their cultural lens to their experience. Wales may have been small, but its people had a big influence on many areas of Indian life during this period. I know we've done a little bit of a skip ahead, but I want to go back in time and talk a little bit about what sets this up. And one of the most prominent roles that the Welsh people played in the colonial India was through missionary work. From the early 19th century, Welsh missionaries traveled to India, particularly to the northeastern part of India, where they sought to spread Christianity, as well as Welsh educational values. Northeast India was an area where Welsh Calvinist Methodists sought to spread their version of Christianity, from translating the Bible into local languages to helping preserve indigenous cultures. Welsh missionaries had a profound impact on the region, and this is something we're going to talk about in more detail, and I think is an important aspect to remember, is that for every side of this discussion, there are positives and negatives that go with it, and we have to be cognizant of that. And we have to recognize when the so-called positives aren't always that great. And we have to acknowledge when things are being seen through a lens which is very different from our own. Keep in mind, this is in a period of time where the British ethos that was driving a lot of the colonial beliefs come from this idea of spreading the gospel, spreading Christianity as a driving force in order to help, in quotes, other people and other societies and other cultures and other races to try and bring them into the light, to educate them in the so-called European way. Perhaps the most famous of these missionaries was Thomas Jones, a Welsh Presbyterian minister who arrived in Cherrapunji in 1841. Jones is often called the father of the Khasi alphabet. He not only spread Christianity, but he also worked to create a written script in this local Khasi language. This was a crucial step in preserving the Khasi language and culture. For Jones, his mission was not only religious, but also linguistic and cultural, as an interesting reflection of the Welsh concern over preserving its own language and culture, something that I think all of us, if you've studied Welsh history at all, would understand all too well. This, of course, drove in the face of those who were dealing with English dominance at home and over the ideals of British society. However, these missions were, of course, not without controversy due to the links that they had with colonialism and, of course, some of the problems surrounding them, which went beyond that. Jones's work highlighted the complex relationship between the Welsh and the Empire. On the one hand, he's a part of the colonial effort to bring the British, and specifically Welsh, values to India. On the other hand, his efforts to preserve the Khasi language echo the struggles that the Welsh people had to maintain their own linguistic and cultural identity. So you can see this positive and negative effect. For many Welsh people, the missionary movement was a way of spreading not only Christianity, but also values of education, community service, language preservation. Welsh missionaries were particularly active in northeast India, in places like the Khasi Hills, in modern-day Meghalaya, Assam, and Manipur. Apologize if I've said any of that wrong. One of the most significant figures in this missionary movement, as previously mentioned, was Thomas Jones. He was born in Denbighshire, Wales, in 1810. Jones became a Presbyterian minister and set out for India in 1841 under the sponsorship of the Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Mission. His destination was the aforementioned Khasi Hills, a lush mountainous region in the northeast of India. When he arrived, Jones encountered the Khasi people, an indigenous community with their own language, customs, and culture, and obviously religious beliefs. Unlike some missionaries, Jones didn't see his mission strictly as converting the local population to Christianity. He believed in the power of language and education as tools of empowerment, something that was central to a lot of the nonconformists in Wales who had spent time working in Welsh to teach people literacy in their own language rather than just teaching in English. Of course, we talked a little bit before about the conflicts between the Anglicans, reformers of education, and the Calvinists and nonconformists who generally were willing to teach in the local language, even if their ability to teach or their access to information was not as complete or as good as what was on offer through the Anglicans and their English language teaching. He took the time to learn the language and realized early on that the Khasi people did not have a written script. This was a challenge, obviously, because it would be difficult to teach someone to read if they don't even have literacy in their own language. But Jones saw it as an opportunity. He worked with the Khasi people to develop a written alphabet based on Roman script. By doing this, he helped not only spread Christianity, helping to read the Bible, but also preserved the language. Obviously, if you have a written script, it's a lot easier to keep your language than it is if you're strictly verbal only, especially in a world that is increasingly more and more literate and more dependent on literacy. This work had a long-lasting impact, and today Khasi remains a vital and vibrant language, thanks in part to Jones's efforts. He helped lay the foundations to the Khasi people to record their oral traditions, stories, and histories in writing. This was a radical shift and was a huge step in preserving the Khasi culture. In fact, Thomas Jones is still celebrated every year in the communities on June 22nd, which is called Thomas Jones Day, to honor his contribution to the Khasi society. But as you can imagine, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The missionary work of the Welsh Calvinist Methodists, like Thomas Jones, came with its own set of challenges and criticisms. Jones clashed with both British colonial authorities and his missionary colleagues, who didn't necessarily hold his beliefs in trying to teach and preserve the language and culture. He was critical of the colonial exploitation and often advocated for the rights of the Khasi people. In a way, a very narrow way, he mirrored the Jesuits who entered Central and South America, often clashing with Spanish authorities who sought to displace local Aboriginal people and force them into Spanish-speaking enclaves. Jones's commitment to the Khasi people put him at odds with British colonial officials consistently, who sometimes saw these missionaries as tools to consolidate their control over the local population. But Welsh missionaries like Jones were often focused on education, literacy, social reform, rather than on propping up British power dynamics. Jones's dedication to his work eventually led to friction with the East India Company, as you can imagine, even as his own missionary society became frustrated with him. He attempted to lead his own missions in the faces of these challenges in a place called Pomerang, which continued nonetheless to see him struggle. Controversially, after the death of his first wife, Thomas remarried, and this is what created the friction between him and his own missions, because the missionary society was very unhappy that he married Emma Cattle, who at the time was only 15 years old, and you can imagine the scandal of that particular marriage. Because of this scandal, Jones had to go, and he left the mission area to fund himself either through trading or farming. I found sources that said both, so I don't know which it is. And yet he still kept up with translating and book printing in the language of the Khasi people. After Jones left the mission, he would suffer the loss of his son to his new wife, who was stillborn, and then he himself died in 1849, only 2 years later, catching malaria. Despite this, his legacy lives on in the Khasi Hills, where his work with this language is still remembered and is one of the more important cultural contributions of the Welsh during the colonial period. However, Jones was, of course, not the only one working in India who left impressions there. Other Welsh missionaries, like William Price, followed in his footsteps, continuing the educational mission that Jones had begun. Price translated religious texts into Khasi and Garo languages, furthering the work of creating accessible written materials in these indigenous tongues. They would then go on to build schools, provide medical care, and support social reform. For instance, many missionaries advocated for the education of women, a progressive stance for the time and one that would have been perceived as relatively unusual. This focus on education and social welfare made Welsh missionaries somewhat different from their counterparts, whose primary focus was often just on conversion. This made their relationship between the Welsh missionaries and the local communities in the northeast of India more complex than a simple narrative of colonial domination. While the missionaries did introduce Christianity and definitely were pushing an idea of British cultural norms and beliefs, they still played a key role in preserving local languages and their own local cultural practices, which in some ways resisted the homogenizing influence of British colonialism. Their focus on education, and particularly local languages, laid groundwork for future generations to maintain their cultural identity even as they engaged with modern ideas. However, the Welsh missionary movement also raised important questions. While their work in education and language preservation was significant, it's crucial to remember that there was still a larger colonial project on the go, and they were very much a part of it. Christianity was introduced as part to reshape these indigenous societies to match up with the ideal of Britain. No different, really, from what we see in Roman times and in medieval times, when places would be captured and you would take elites back to the home country to effectively train them in the local language, in the local culture, to send them back to basically be good citizens of the imperial ideals, be it Rome or elsewhere. And so you would have this concept and this desire to do similarly. And we do see this happen. There is a movement to try and have, especially post-secondary education, push people from the colonies back towards London specifically to try and educate them in a way that would bring them up as effectively just being colonial versions of Britain. And so that when the British colonies would start to spin off into independent countries, or at least reliant but yet separate countries from Britain, they would still hold all of those same cultural norms and cultural desires. This, of course, would be fought against both at that time and even up till now, and there are still a lot of problems and issues politically around this that we certainly see in the modern age. But it is something to remember that while the Welsh missionaries are going there to be a part of the colonial project, they're definitely not the only reason they're there. It's definitely not the only thing influencing them. And I think it's something to keep in mind when we talk about all this, that there are other things driving them beyond that. And for some of them, it is what their experience in the UK is, as people who may speak Welsh, who may come from a culture that's slightly different or slightly aside from the dominant culture of the English. And I think that's something to measure when we look at all these things. It's a complicated process. The entirety of the Imperial period is a complicated thing, because for every good thing that might come about it, there's 10 bad things that come from it. And so does the good outweigh the bad? There are a lot of people that would say no, and there are other people that would say yes. And I'm not here to tell you how to think on this, but I think it's important to remember that this is something that we're going to deal more and more with as we go further and further in the 1800s, because you're going to have more and more colonies and the dependence on them, and more Welsh people going out to them and having influence in them for various reasons. With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and viewing today. I hope this was helpful. Certainly, we're just touching the surface of what was going on in India and other places. So I want to make that clear. We're going to go back there a few times, I'm sure, before the end of this series. But for right now, I think that's where I want to leave it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com, or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Welsh History Pod, or you can join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you would like to contribute to the podcast, you can always do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. And I appreciate anyone and everyone who donates. You are magnificent, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you once again, everybody. Have yourselves a spectacular day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.